Before there were borders, armies, or treaties, there was only water, flowing freely through ancestral mountains, carving valleys, nurturing forests, washing the roots of an entire civilization. The waters of the Indus and its tributaries are far more than liquid streams. They are open veins in the history of South Asia. They are born from sacred glaciers, wind through the Himalayas, and pass through fields, villages, and cities that witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Long before they became a geopolitical bargaining chip, they were legends told by fishermen, offerings cast by priests, and paths followed by caravans of silk and salt. The Indus River, in particular, is almost a mythical entity. The very word India comes from it. And ironically, the river that named a country now flows mostly through another, Pakistan. This geographical paradox says much about the scars left by the 1947 partition. That year, when British India was divided into two independent nations, the lines were drawn quickly on paper but deeply into the souls of their peoples. Peoples who, for centuries, prayed on the same banks, drank from the same source, and now find themselves on opposite sides of an arbitrary division. These waters know no passports. They are born free, unaware that they will be measured, channeled, and disputed. From the Himalayan snow to the Punjab plains, they cross fertile lands, pine forests, and military tension zones. Some of these waters have flowed over battlefields. Others have nourished crops in times of peace. Rivers like the Jhelum, the Chenab, and the Ravi have witnessed the dance of Vedic civilizations, the arrival of Islam, the building of temples and mosques, and even the rise of British railroads. In their reflections, one sees a time before the very idea of nations. But in 2025, these waters ceased to be just rivers. They became symbols of rupture. After the attack in Kashmir that claimed the lives of 26 civilians in a brutal bombing, the Indian government decided to unilaterally suspend the Indus Waters Treaty, an agreement signed over 60 years ago that had survived wars, diplomatic crises, and regime changes. It was a liquid bridge that united two countries through the shared need to survive. Its suspension was seen by many as more dangerous than an artillery strike. When a water treaty is suspended, what's at stake is not just the right to irrigate crops, but the very idea of coexistence. The Indus, which is born in India and empties into Pakistan, sustains over 80% of Pakistan's agriculture. Its interruption, even partial or symbolic, can affect harvests, local economies, and entire lives that depend on a calendar dictated by rains and reservoirs. In India, on the other hand, the move was seen as a justified retaliation, a show of strength in the face of pain inflicted by terror. And yet, the river continues. It flows in silence. It ignores decrees and borders. It carries sediments from millennia, stories of kings, poets, and shepherds. It still passes under bridges guarded by soldiers and by children who throw rocks into the water as if the world weren't on the verge of collapse. In many villages, the river is more than geopolitics. It's a grandmother who sings lullabies, a living being who listens to prayers, a silent oracle that witnesses all cycles, from birth to mourning, from harvest to abandonment. It is no coincidence that many wars begin or end near a river, because where there is water, there is life, and where there is life, there is conflict. But there is also hope. Hope that one day, these waters will no longer be seen as weapons, but as bridges. Hope that future history will not be written in blood on the riverbanks, but in verses, like those that once praised the Indus as a father, as sacred, as eternal. While the world argues, while politicians sign papers and nations arm themselves, the river simply flows. Its course is slow, deep, and inevitable, like time itself. There are places in the world where time feels heavier, where silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything that has already been said. Kashmir is one of those places, a valley suspended between snow-capped mountains, covered by mists that seem to guard ancient secrets. A land where every stone, every leaf, every whisper of the wind carries layers of forgotten stories and memories that never leave. To some, Kashmir is nothing more than a disputed zone. To others, it is the last remnant of a paradise that has survived the violence of time. But for those who live there, it is home. And like every home marked by both beauty and trauma, it is loved and feared in equal measure. Kashmir was not always a symbol of conflict. Long before political divisions, it was a center of knowledge. The ancient Sharada Peeth, now in ruins on the Pakistani side, was once one of Asia's first universities. Buddhist, Hindu, and later Muslim scholars would sit side by side along the banks of the Jhelum River, debating the infinite, writing about the stars, teaching that the world is made of layers, of reality, and of dream. It was a land of weavers, poets, and artisans who turned wool into tapestries and pain into song. Every spring the valley would bloom in a spectacle of color that brought tears to the eyes of travelers. The gardens built by the Mughal emperors, like Shalimar and Nishat, still carry the fragrance of a time when power was measured also by delicacy. But Kashmir's blessed geography became a curse in the 20th century. When British India was partitioned in 1947, the fate of the region was left in limbo. A Hindu prince ruled over a Muslim-majority population. Pressured, hesitant, and with invasion looming, he signed the instrument of accession to India in haste, sealing decades of tension. Since then, 3 wars, countless skirmishes, and an imaginary line called the Line of Control have divided the valley between India and Pakistan. But no line can divide a people who share the same sky, the same language, the same bread, and the same trauma. In 2025, Kashmir was once again torn from its fragile calm. The terrorist attack in April that claimed the lives of 26 innocent civilians in Pulwama was not just another act of violence. It was a wound reopened in a fabric that never had time to fully heal. The sound of the explosion echoed not only through frozen valleys, but also through the hearts of those who still remember the long nights of blackouts, curfews, and disappearances. More than a political act, it was a brutal reminder that for many, Kashmir is still a living wound. But while the headlines speak of numbers, soldiers, and treaties, who listens to the voices that actually live in the valley? The mother who lost her son while crossing the border. The young man who dreams of being an engineer but is too afraid to leave home. The old storyteller who once saw red snow and swore never to be silent again. For them, war is not breaking news. It is daily life. It is the absence of sleep at the sound of helicopters. It is the fear of planting and never harvesting. It is watching a village lose hope with each passing season. And yet, even in this valley of eternal echoes, life persists. Every morning, Kashmiri women still comb their hair in front of the mirror. The mosque bells still ring like childhood songs. Shepherds still guide their flocks through icy slopes. Markets still fill with spices, with stories whispered between sips of tea and silence. The valley breathes, even with lungs constricted by tension. And maybe that's the most beautiful and most tragic truth. Kashmir is life surrounded by fear, and yet it is still life. Night falls over the mountains like a veil of black silk. The stars, indifferent to men, shine over both sides of the border. And down below, in the heart of the valley, the loudest echo is not of bombs, but of questions that were never answered. Who are we without peace? How long can one live in suspension? And if one day the guns fall silent, will Kashmir become once again what it once was? A place where silence is poetry, not fear. Once upon a time, there was a land where the sound of prayers mingled with birdsong, where men of different faiths shared bread under the same shade, where the blue sky knew no borders. That land was called India. But what we now call India and Pakistan was once a single body, a single people, a single ancestral breath. The story of their separation is not merely political. It is a lament, a deep wound in the fabric of humanity, a bond undone in haste, with tears and blood, in the name of a new beginning, one that, sadly, was born with old wounds. The year was 1947. The world was still licking the wounds of World War II when the British Empire, weakened and worn, decided to grant independence to its most valuable colony. But the time of freedom came hand in hand with the time of division. Under pressure from religious factions, British India was split into 2 nations, one with a Hindu majority, the other with a Muslim majority, India and Pakistan. But how do you split a people? How do you cut a shared culture with invisible lines and expect the pain not to overflow? Partition was an open wound. In just a few months, over 15 million people crossed newly drawn borders in one of the largest mass migrations in modern history. Families were torn apart, villages burned, convoys attacked. Between 500,000 and 2 million lives are estimated to have been lost. Women were abducted, children vanished, temples desecrated, and even those who reached the right side never forgot what they left behind. A fig tree in the yard, a house with no lock, a neighbor with whom they once shared salt. The trauma of partition doesn't live only in books. It pulses today in the veins of those who inherited memories they never lived, but still feel. What should have been a new beginning became the seed of a conflict that has never truly ended. Barely 2 months after independence, India and Pakistan were already at war over Kashmir. Since then, their relationship has swung between truce and tension, like brothers who no longer know how to meet each other's eyes, but still recognize the blood they share. 3 formal wars, countless skirmishes, and a nuclear arms race were planted in the fertile soil of mutual distrust. But what if we look beyond the headlines? If we walk through a bazaar in Lahore or down an old street in Amritsar, if we listen to street musicians playing the same melodies, to poets reciting the same verses in Urdu or Hindi, if we watch mothers telling their children the same stories, about brave kings and playful gods, about impossible love and stubborn hope, India and Pakistan are more alike than they dare to admit. Both bow before the same moon, celebrate weddings with the same drums, and mourn loss with the same tear. Today, in 2025, the past still lives in the eyes of those who remember, and in the silences of those who choose to forget. The younger generation, born into a connected digital age, asks, how long? How long will the other's name be a threat, not a neighbor? How long will fear dictate the songs that could be danced together? How long will pride be stronger than the memory that once we were one? Perhaps the answer lies not in palaces or parliaments, but in bridges. In the small and rare efforts at cultural dialogue, in the films shared across borders, in the cross-border romances, in the words secretly exchanged by young people who have never seen the frontier, but have felt it in their chests. India and Pakistan are not merely nations in conflict. They are fractured mirrors, brothers separated not only by time, but by ghosts that have yet to be laid to rest. And perhaps, to find peace again, we must first remember that once, before everything, they were one. Night falls over the subcontinent like a blanket of ancient memories, and as the clocks tick on in the present, hearts remain caught in a question that spans generations. Will it ever be possible to be neighbors again without fear, or at the very least, to hear the other's name without pain? Wars have a scent, a dry, metallic scent that blends gunpowder, sweat, and overturned earth. But wars also have sound, not just the explosions, but the muffled screams no one hears, the letters that never arrive, the silence that covers the names that vanish from maps. Between India and Pakistan, that sound has repeated itself 3 times officially, and countless times without warning, without declaration, without truce. It's curious how books record dates, treaties, the names of generals, but rarely mention the cold that soldiers feel in the trenches of Siachen, the eyes that watch the other side of the border through sleepless nights, the longing that grows even where peace does not. The first war came right after independence in 1947. It was the birth of a nation, and like every forced birth, it came with blood. The dispute was over control of Kashmir, that valley suspended between mountains, as beautiful as it is strategic. The newly formed armies fought as best they could, driven more by emotion than by logistics. The result was a division of the region between the 2 countries, marked by a line called the Line of Control, a line that doesn't resolve, only freezes the conflict. The UN intervened, but the agreement left open wounds. To India, Kashmir was an inseparable part of its territory. To Pakistan, it was a broken promise, a Muslim people who should have been with them. In 1965, the Second War. This time, with more organized forces, tanks and planes crossed borders, as if there were no tomorrow. The conflict spread from Punjab to the heights of Kashmir, and the world held its breath. The US and USSR, in the midst of the Cold War, intervened diplomatically, resulting in the Tashkent Agreement in Uzbekistan, a document promising peace, cooperation, and a return to the status quo. But how many treaties can hold peace when the heart remains at war? In 1971, the third and most intense war. This time, the spark was in the east, the war for the independence of Bangladesh, then known as East Pakistan. India intervened in support of the Bengalis, and within 2 weeks, Pakistan suffered a decisive defeat. A new country was born, wounds multiplied, trust dissolved. And once again, Kashmir remained a thorn buried deep, an unfulfilled promise. But there are wars with no official end. Since the 1980s, skirmishes and ongoing clashes have taken place in Siachen, the highest battlefield in the world. Soldiers face not just the enemy, but extreme cold, avalanches, and total isolation. Up there, the war is against forgetting. A frozen conflict, literally, where every step must be taken with care, for the snow can swallow even sound. And then came Kargil. In 1999, Pakistani militants crossed the line of control and occupied strategic positions in Indian territory. India responded with airstrikes and infantry. It was a short, intense, televised war. Perhaps for the first time, war entered people's homes in real time. Images of soldiers, trenches, goodbyes. The world watched, and soon forgot, because such wars between brothers are frequent, emotional, poorly healed, and between them, attempts at peace, the Lahore Declaration, dialogues in Agra, phone calls exchanged during earthquakes and tragedies. There were promises, there were handshakes, flowers, diplomatic smiles, and there were attacks. Like Mumbai, in 2008, where more than 170 people died, and a decade of progress crumbled. Broken promises leave cracks, and each new generation is born atop ruins it barely understands. Young people in Delhi and Islamabad grow up hearing about the other as an enemy, and yet share music, memes, movies, and poetry. A painful paradox. To love what you cannot touch, to hate what you recognize. The real war between India and Pakistan may have never been truly won or lost. It continues as mistrust, in the words left unsaid at UN meetings, in the nuclear tests that became displays of national ego, in school maps that show different borders, and most of all, in the absence of a sincere conversation, without an audience, without protocol, without a flag raised. And perhaps, in a world where wars repeat, the bravest act is to keep a single promise, just one that says, no more. But until then, soldiers will keep watching the frozen mountains, diplomats will keep writing fragile agreements, and families will keep praying for sons who patrol imaginary lines. Time moves on, but memories don't sign treaties. It was a morning like so many others in the valley of Kashmir. The sky still wore the pale veil of dawn. The mountains were draped in a silent mist, and the birds, as always, sang before the first human footsteps invaded the damp fields. Children were on their way to school, shopkeepers opening their doors, young people walking in groups through the narrow streets of Pulwama, a small town nestled in the heart of the dispute. But on that April morning in 2025, a sound shattered the gentle rhythm of routine. An explosion, dry, violent, echoing through the hills like an impatient thunder. In a matter of seconds, time stopped, and history restarted. The attack left 26 dead, innocent civilians. Among them were teachers, a school bus driver, 3 merchants, and 7 students. It wasn't the number that shocked people. It was the repetition. The repetition of a familiar pain, of a script Kashmir had long since memorized. The smell of smoke, the screams, the wide eyes of those who saw the ground open beneath their feet. The explosion struck a central market, where people were still arranging fruit and sweeping sidewalks. The torn bodies were covered with the very scarves of those who worked there. A woman screamed for her son who had gone to buy tea. An old man recited verses from the Quran with trembling hands. And then came silence, the silence that always follows tragedy, not out of respect, but disbelief. Hours later, the first reports reached newsrooms in India. In New Delhi, networks broke into programming. In Islamabad, the government condemned the attack, denied involvement, and called for caution. But in India, the public outcry was immediate. Enough. Enough of unanswered attacks, enough of waiting for justice that never came, enough of promises of dialogue that led nowhere. The Indian government, under pressure from national mourning and a history of unhealed wounds, decided to act. And the gesture was both symbolic and strategic: the suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty. This treaty, signed in 1960 with World Bank mediation, had guaranteed Pakistan control over the western waters of the Indus River, while India retained the eastern tributaries. For decades, even in times of war, the agreement was respected, a rare example of cooperation between rivals. But with a single decree, India threatened to cut off a vital flow to Pakistan. It wasn't just water that was at stake, it was the spirit of the pact. It was the message that bridges could indeed be burned. And more. The following week, Indian fighter jets crossed the skies of the Himalayas toward strategic points along the border. Alleged terrorist training camps were bombed. Reports spoke of dozens killed. Pakistan responded with condemnations, troop reinforcements, and rhetoric that echoed the dark days of 1999. The border, always tense, now pulsed with the electricity of looming war. But what happens on the other side of the headlines? What happens in the quiet homes of Kashmir, where a mother lights a candle for the son who will not return? What happens to the father who must explain to the youngest that the eldest is gone? What goes through the mind of a young Indian soldier assigned to patrol the slopes of Sopore, or in the heart of a Pakistani recruit watching the line of control with eyes wet with fear? They don't know each other, but they share the same exhaustion. The same sense that for some war is a geopolitical game, and for others, it is the end of everything. The April attack was more than an act of terror. It was the awakening of ghosts that never slept. It revived broken agreements, bitter memories, and the eternal question: is there a way out of this cycle? Every time an attack occurs, every time a counterattack follows, the hope for reconciliation moves further away. And the valley, so fertile, so beautiful, once again becomes a stage for tears and vigils. And yet, when the sun sets behind the mountains of Baramulla, the city is cloaked in golden light. There is still tea boiling in copper pots. There are still stories whispered around the fire. There are still promises murmured at the roots of ancient trees, as if calling on the ancestors to intervene. Because even in times of war, life is stubborn. It insists on continuing. And perhaps, just perhaps, within that quiet act of continuing to live, lies the most powerful form of resistance. There is something deeply symbolic about the waters of a river. They do not recognize fences, obey no decrees, and care nothing for the color of a flag. They simply flow, like history, like time, like pain. And between India and Pakistan, the Indus River is not just a watercourse. It is a timeless witness to human fragility. It is the backbone of an entire civilization, now trapped in a conflict that tries to control the uncontrollable, the right to life that pulses, invisible, through the veins of the earth. The Indus Waters Treaty, signed in 1960, is a diplomatic miracle in itself. Born just years after 2 wars and countless deaths, it was mediated by the World Bank and became one of the few enduring agreements between the two nations. A pact between rivals who decided, if only for a moment, that water would be neutral ground. That while they fired accusations and built invisible walls, the rivers would still unite, not divide. According to the treaty, Pakistan would have exclusive control over the 3 western rivers, Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, while India would retain the eastern ones, Ravi, Beas, and Sutlej. Although India holds the headwaters of the main rivers, it agreed to limit its use, provided it could make non-consumptive use, like hydropower generation, as long as it didn't affect the flow destined for its neighbor. A delicate balance, like walking on a ribbon of water. But for decades, it worked. Even during the wars of 1965 and 1971. Even after both nations tested nuclear weapons. Even through terrorist attacks, border disputes, and skirmishes. The treaty endured until 2025, when India announced the practical suspension of the treaty following the terrorist attack in Pulwama. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a strategic pivot. Water, once a symbol of moderation, became a silent weapon. If India chose to dam or divert significant volumes, the farmlands of Pakistani Punjab, which rely directly on the Indus, could dry up. And Pakistan, a country where agriculture makes up over 20% of GDP, would face a food collapse. It would be like closing the veins of an entire body. But India too walks on thin ice. The Indus and its tributaries flow through regions of Kashmir, administered by New Delhi, and aggressive interference could lead to floods, population displacement, and above all, severe international backlash. After all, what happens when diplomacy evaporates and water becomes an ultimatum? In Islamabad, reactions were immediate. The issue was brought to the UN, emergency conferences were convened, and the satellites of major powers turned their eyes toward Indian dams. But more than diplomatic maneuvers, the suspension awakened a deeper fear. The fear that the last thread of trust between two sibling nations had finally snapped. Meanwhile, on the quiet banks of the Indus, farmers continue to scatter seeds. Children still play barefoot near the water. Women fill jars, unaware of the arguments between foreign ministers. The water keeps flowing, indifferent to the tension hanging over its course. And perhaps that is both the tragedy and the beauty of this story, that for those who truly need the water, treaties and borders don't matter. What matters is that it comes, that it flows. The suspension of the treaty was perhaps the clearest signal that peace is running dry. And in an age of climate change, severe droughts and growing scarcity, turning water into a weapon is a sentence to permanent instability. India claims defense. Pakistan calls it aggression. The world watches, and the Indus, the same river that named civilizations and gave birth to empires, now flows under threat. But some still believe nature teaches best, that just as a river can be dammed, it can also find new routes. That water always finds a way, and that diplomacy, perhaps, should be like water, patient, persistent, without a fixed shape, but with a clear direction. May this treaty, broken or not, be remembered not as the end of a cycle, but as a reminder that some things should rise above dispute, that some bridges are built of invisible elements, trust, necessity, survival, and that to destroy them is to endanger not only peace, but humanity itself. There are borders drawn on the land, with fences, checkpoints, flags, and soldiers, but there are also borders in the sky, invisible, silent, yet just as heavily guarded. The airspace between India and Pakistan is not merely territory above the clouds. It is a zone of tension where the air feels heavy, the radars never sleep, and the general's eyes remain fixed upward, where every trace on the screen could be the start of catastrophe. And it was in that thin, nearly untouchable space that war began to whisper again. After the April attack in Pulwama, India's response was swift and precise. Mirage 2000 fighter jets took off at dawn, crossing the line of control with a clear mission: to strike targets believed to be terrorist training camps on Pakistani soil. The operation was given a symbolic name, as all military actions are, hiding pain behind cold, strategic words. Within minutes, laser-guided bombs fell on what the reports called enemy facilities. On the ground, the impact was immediate. Structures collapsed, dust covered nearby villages, and rumors spread faster than sound. Pakistan reacted with outrage. It declared a violation of its airspace, threatened proportional retaliation, and the next day launched its own fighter jets. The skies above the Himalayas became a dangerous dance of evasive maneuvers, zigzags between clouds, jets chasing each other like shadows over the mountains. In one of these encounters, an Indian fighter was shot down. The pilot ejected and was captured across the border. For a moment, the world held its breath. The pilot became a symbol of heroism in India and a diplomatic peace in Pakistan. Days later, he was returned, a gesture many saw as a rare spark of humanity in the chaos. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new era of silent war. Satellites began flying over the region more frequently. Drones armed with cameras and missiles started crossing borders without needing permission. What was once declared was now disguised. War became hybrid, technological, almost invisible to the common eye. Cyber attacks began targeting critical infrastructure. Mysterious failures at dams, unexplained blackouts in cities near the border, air defense systems triggered with no apparent cause. The line between test and threat, illusion and intent, grew too thin to detect. And yet, while the skies roar, people continue living beneath them. In villages near the border, residents can recognize the sound of a fighter jet from miles away. The metallic hum above no longer causes surprise, only resignation. Children grow up knowing when to run for shelter. Elders tell stories of other wars, other sounds, as if each generation were trained to survive the same stormy sky. And even those far from the border, in cities like Mumbai or Karachi, feel the weight in the air. A weight not seen, but sensed. A sky that should be infinite, but now is divided by fear, radars, and silence. The war in the air is, at its core, the war of the unspoken, a display of power that needs no words, a low flyover over foreign land like saying, "We are here, and we can go deeper." A subtle threat, a claim over the symbolic space where freedom should be absolute. Because to dominate the skies is also to dominate the imagination of the enemy. But is there a way back? Can the skies become neutral again? Mere paths for birds and clouds, a backdrop for comets and stars? Or are we now condemned to look upward with dread, expecting not the rain, but the next roar? As leaders give speeches and radars blink in climate-controlled command centers, a boy in Muzaffarabad flies a kite. It rises slowly, spinning, fluttering as if defying the laws of fear. He watches it with a shy smile, unaware that in that same sky, missiles await orders. And maybe, just maybe, that kite is the boldest form of resistance. Because even in skies occupied by war, there is still room for a thread of hope. Between mountains that touch the sky and valleys that hide centuries, lives a people divided without ever having chosen. Kashmir, the land of heavenly gardens and serene waters, is now a trembling line between two worlds. On one side, the gaze of India. On the other, the gaze of Pakistan. In between, a people who carry on their shoulders a history they did not write. Men and women born on the same soil, under the same starlit sky, but who grew up with different names for the same places, with different flags flying above the same schools. The line of control, which was meant to be just an imaginary line, became an invisible wall between similar hearts. It cut through families, separated villages, divided wheat fields. Many residents live just a few kilometers from relatives they haven't seen in decades, who speak the same language, pray the same prayers. Crossing is nearly impossible. Phone calls are monitored, letters take months, and when they arrive, they come censored, with holes in the paper where once there were feelings. On the Indian-administered side, Kashmir carries a special weight. After the abrogation of Article 370 in 2019, which granted the region a degree of autonomy, the sense of belonging fractured. The valley, already militarized, became even more surrounded. Checkpoints, drones flying over crops, internet blackouts lasting weeks. Youth who once dreamed of education and freedom now grow up in an atmosphere where every step feels watched. And yet, art persists. Poets continue to write about the beauty of the chinar in autumn. Musicians still play the rabab and the santoor at dusk. Here, resistance is composed in melody. On the Pakistani-administered side, known as Azad Kashmir, Free Kashmir, the sentiment is more ambiguous. There is more apparent political freedom, yet also a constant presence of the Pakistani military, watching the border as if guarding a secret. The villages live with the distant sound of artillery, with the possibility of sudden evacuation. And still, schools operate, markets sell bright spices, and children recite surahs at dawn. Life insists, even in the gray zones of geopolitics. But perhaps the true guardians of Kashmir are not in the capitals, nor in the barracks, nor in the embassies. They are in the eyes of a seamstress embroidering ancient floral patterns in Srinagar, not knowing if there will be a buyer next month. They are in the hands of a boatman in Muzaffarabad, rowing his shikara through still waters as if nothing had changed. They are in the memory of an old shepherd who once led his flock across both sides of the border, before the war, before the maps, before the fear. These voices, calm yet persistent, do not appear in headlines, but they sing. They sing old songs that speak of love between mountains, of longing for a time when the world felt whole. They sing about apple orchards, about the first snowflake on a rooftop, about the smell of bread baked in clay ovens. And in those songs, Kashmir is not a dispute. It is home. There is something profoundly human in resisting without shouting, in smiling at a visitor, even when fearing for them, in teaching a child the names of flowers, even as tanks roll down the road. This is the Kashmir that lives beyond the headlines, the Kashmir that weaves its history with threads of silence, of hope, of tenderness. While powers compete with speeches, the Kashmiri people continue to live between worlds, never fully belonging to either. But perhaps they belong to something greater. Perhaps they belong to the land, to the snow, to the ancient gods, to the whispers of ancestors. Perhaps they belong to the very idea that, even in division, the soul cannot be broken. And when night falls over the valley, there is no border that can stop the wind from crossing. No army that can silence the song of crickets. No treaty that can keep a father from looking at the sky and wishing, in silence, that his son may have a future freer than his own. Sometimes the world does not speak, but watches, and there are moments when that silence is deafening. When India and Pakistan once again approached the edge in 2025, the entire planet seemed to hold its breath. The borders didn't just tremble in Asia. They trembled in European offices, in the corridors of Washington, in United Nations assemblies, and in the quiet chambers of Beijing and Moscow. Because when two nuclear powers exchange real threats, fear has no nationality. It is global, invisible, and spreads like a whisper among diplomats, generals, and ordinary citizens. At the UN, speeches multiplied. Calls for dialogue, appeals for peace, statements of condemnation, and promises of mediation. But behind the words, there was hesitation. The major powers, the United States, China, Russia, the European Union, knew that a single misstep could reignite not just a regional war, but a blaze of unpredictable proportions. The Security Council met behind closed doors. The language was diplomatic, but the fear was unmistakable. They feared the unforeseen. They feared that, in some remote outpost, one impulsive decision could trigger a chain of events no one could contain. Pakistan sought support from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. India activated dialogue with strategic allies, reinforcing that its strike was preemptive, precise, necessary. The allies, in turn, tried to balance the scale without spilling a single drop. No one wanted to be the country that lit the match near the barrel, but everyone knew it would only take one mistake, one uncontrolled escalation, and the world would wake up different. In China, a restless neighbor to both nations, attention was heightened. Beijing has strategic interests in the region, sensitive borders, and a vital economic corridor running through Pakistan. Its diplomats, skilled in walking fine lines, suggested moderation and offered to mediate, but condemned no one. China doesn't intervene to change narratives. It intervenes to preserve order, and its priority order is stability. The United States, on the other hand, tread carefully. Washington has mediated crises between the two nations in the past, but now faces its own geopolitical dilemmas. A world in flux, fragile alliances, a global stage increasingly fragmented. Still, it pushed for restraint, and behind the scenes, it activated direct military channels with New Delhi and Islamabad to avoid misunderstandings, the kind that can ignite continents. Russia, as always, watched in strategic silence. Once a close ally of India, but now with growing interests in Pakistan, it preferred to maintain its ambiguous stance. It issued generic statements, condemning terrorism and calling for peace, without naming culprits. Moscow plays the game of geopolitics with ancient patience. It knows every conflict brings opportunity, and it knows, too, that those who talk the most often act the least. And while leaders debate and markets waver, ordinary people try to make sense of it all. Young people in Berlin reading about the tensions on their phones and wondering if the future still belongs to them. Teachers in Africa reminding students that the world is a board of fragile alliances. Mothers in Buenos Aires listening to the news and feeling an unexplained tightness in their chest. Because even from afar, everyone recognizes the scent of instability. Yet there are also those who look on with hope. NGOs, mediators, academics, peace activists. Men and women who still believe that diplomacy can be stronger than hatred, that dialogue can break old cycles. In Geneva, Tokyo, Brussels, voices rise saying, yes, it is possible to build bridges, even over rivers that bleed. Perhaps the greatest challenge of modern diplomacy is this: to speak where trauma has silenced, to convince historical enemies to see one another not as threats, but as reflections. In 2025, once again, the world was tested, and it learned that, even with all our technology, even with all our treaties, we are still captives of ancient emotions: fear, pride, memory, thirst for justice. But we also learned something else. The world watches, and sometimes when it watches, it changes. What begins as an attack in a distant valley can turn into a revolution in the heart of a diplomat. A child who sees war on TV may grow up determined to one day sign the treaty that was never written. And perhaps that is why it is worth continuing to tell these stories, so that, amid so much silence, someone still listens. There is a moment, there always is, when even the weary earth sighs. A moment when silence is no longer fear, but invitation. When the past stops screaming and begins to whisper. It is in that rare interval, between exhaustion and clarity, that the question is born, the one that changes everything. What if? What if it were possible to begin again? Time is a silent sculptor. It is never in a rush, but it is relentless. It erases names carved in stone, but it eternalizes feelings in the wind. Time has witnessed empires fall, enemies embrace, walls crumble into dust, and treaties emerge from hands once stained with blood. Time knows. And in 2025, it seems to be whispering again among the mountains of Kashmir, asking for something simple, yet exceedingly rare: peace. Peace is not forgetting. It is not pretending the pain never happened. Peace is remembering and choosing differently. It is looking at the ruins and deciding to rebuild. It is listening to the voices of the past and still choosing to write another ending. Between India and Pakistan, forgiveness is not a romantic gesture. It is an existential necessity. For millions of lives have already been touched by the conflict, and no war, no matter how long, is eternal. Only memory is. And each generation must choose what to do with it. Reconciliation takes courage. Not the courage of soldiers, but of parents who bury their children and still believe. Of teachers who teach history without hatred. Of young people who write letters across the border, not knowing if anyone will ever reply. Peace is built in small gestures. A film watched together, a poem lovingly translated, a photograph that captures not just pain, but humanity. The scars of the subcontinent will not vanish, but they can stop bleeding. Pain can become lesson. Anger can dissolve into curiosity, and pride, that ancient wall, can be replaced with bridges of mutual dignity. Because no people wish to live under constant alert. No child is born desiring enemies. No heart beats solely for revenge. Behind the borders, the religions, the languages, we are all made of the same breath. And perhaps that is the hidden miracle of history. The constant possibility of starting over. Of extending a hand even after being wounded. Of building a tomorrow without the rubble of yesterday. The rivers still flow. The skies still open at dawn. The mountains of Kashmir, witnesses of centuries, still stand, unshaken, majestic, and perhaps silently hopeful, because time is asking for peace, not as a favor, but as a right. The right to live without fear, to love without geographic limits, to tell stories that do not end in tragedy. And who knows, perhaps one day when the books speak of 2025, they won't tell it as the year war returned, but as the year peace finally began to be written.